You're listening to the Live from the Caribbean podcast, the show that brings the stories of island people making a global impact, with your host, Pauline Joseph.
Hi everyone, Pauline here, and I am so happy that you've decided to listen to Live from the Caribbean podcast again. We have had so many amazing folks from across the globe who are representing the Caribbean, and today we're going to take a little visit to Barbados. And I need to give you a backstory of how I found our guest. I saw an article with the name 𝐶𝐫, and full disclosure for those who don't know, I know my Trini accent might throw you off, but very heavily identify as a Bajan. I know I have identity crisis, Trinidad and Barbados. So with that said, I was like, who's this Shawn guy? He has something interesting to say, and he is perfect for the podcast. So without further ado, Shawn, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Pauline. How you doing? Thanks for having me on the platform. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm Shawn Rochester. I am, president and CEO of a company called Good Steward, and another called PhD Enterprise. I focus on economic advancement for Black people. I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, that quantifies the financial cost of discrimination against Black people in the United States. That's getting a lot of buzz and play. It takes a look at things from an economic analytical standpoint, not from an emotional or moral kind of position. I have a long career in business, finance, strategy, operations, mergers and acquisitions. And that's kind of obviously I was born in Barbados. I grew up there, between there and New York City. Been in the States for, a really long time. I've traveled all over the world and done transactions all over the world. So that's making a long story, the short version of it.
So we're going to get into the Bajan background just now. And I want to just touch on the point you mentioned about the black tax from an analytical perspective. Mm-hmm. And I must say, I mean, when it comes to talks, because I'm a fan of TED Talks, it's very rare that I find that clinical sort of approach to something that people can get very emotional with. Yeah. And I am in marketing, but I love numbers, and seeing how you were able to break that down. I encourage any and everybody to go and check it out, especially during these, I put in massive air quotes here, unprecedented times. Mm-hmm. But it's so important to look at things from that analytical perspective, because numbers don't lie. And I would love to find out, how did you get to this space? Like, where's that story? Because you mentioned your company. What do you do?
Yeah, so we do a couple of things. One, we have a focus on what we call like personal financial management, which is just helping people to better manage the limited resource that they have, so that they have more cash flow available, be able to drive down and eliminate debt over time and maximize their assets at retirement. So we're trying to attack the wealth gap. Part of that is from, how do we manage the limited amount that we have in a more robust way? The other part of it is how do we create jobs? How do we create businesses of all kinds and sizes? And how do we provide capital, right, to be able to help facilitate, all of those things?
So would you say that you're a financial advisor?
Yeah, there's we call it, there's financial coaching, right? And then there's also, I'm an investor in companies. We own businesses. We help raise capital for businesses. And we're always focused on this framework that we call PhD, which stands for purchase, hire, and deposit, in ways that create jobs and create and expand businesses and provide capital in the Black community. We're faced with some really massive economic challenges, and we need to solve those challenges by doing things that are stimulative for job creation, for business development, and making capital available.
So, hypothetically speaking, if you had a small business owner who had some funds in the US and wanted to invest, would that person come to you?
They could. It depends on what they're looking to do. Sometimes people come and they'll buy our classes, online classes, for their employees, right? They might want coaching for themselves, or it might be an institution that procures our coaching and our classes for their employees or their constituents.
Ah, okay. Well, I was trying to get some free advice there, but I'll talk to you after. Hypothetically speaking, that is.
Yeah, we could chat.
So let's talk about that Bajan upbringing, because I think it's so important for me to understand, and those folks out there listening, especially now, quite a number of folks have been losing their jobs in the Caribbean. And one of the main focuses of this podcast is to inspire others. And I would love to hear your story, from Barbados to New York and back.
Yeah. So, I grew up I was born in Barbados, and my mom left, like many others, to go to the U.S. And she started off really as a domestic, like looking after people's children, and and making sure that they food and everything was taken care of. When she had enough resources, she sent for me and my brother, right? And we grew up. We spent a couple of years in Brooklyn, but the majority in Queens, and went to elementary school and finished up at elementary school in Queens. But I used to go back and forth. You know how you would spend your summers, back home. And after I graduated from elementary school, I went back home for the summer, and then I just asked my mom if I could stay. Right, it was kind of out of the blue. It wasn't really planned. Even at a young age, there's a lot of drama that one can get into. Right, in the city, it was a very different environment. When you're back in Barbados, that decision, and she was okay with it because I was staying with her sister. Allowed me to eventually transition into 𝐶𝐸𝐫, which is an extraordinary school in Barbados that I would have never really been able to test into, just because I was a student who was behind in all the testing and all that stuff that they would do kind of in New York. But I was blessed, to go there and was just immersed in an extraordinary environment of excellence. And I struggled at first, but I eventually began to thrive across the board. And it was a 5-year period where, for me, it was like the most formative part of my education. It just prepared me for everything that came afterwards, right? Whether it was engineering, whether it was getting my MBA from one of the best schools in the world, or all of the mergers and acquisitions work that I've done all over the world. That foundation I got at 𝐶𝐸𝐫 is at the base of it.
I can relate. I actually, similar to you, did a transition, because it's kind of weird how similar our stories are, but different countries, because my mom's from Barbados and my dad's from Trinidad. And there was a lot of back and forth for me. And eventually, my mom was like, I want my children. And I started secondary school, which I would assume in the States is called high school at 𝐶𝐸𝐫. Well, actually, the third year at 𝐶𝐸𝐫. So I want to find out from your perspective, why do you think that upbringing from 𝐶𝐸𝐫 was so important for you right now?
It was important for me just in general, right? It's beyond this moment. One of the things was, high performance was just normal, and it was expected, right? You had this great balance of, you could be smart and athletic and mischievous all at the same time, right? You didn't have to separate. You weren't like the athletic folks and then the smart folks and then you know what I mean, troublemakers or whatnot. I was in the best class all the time, and our class got sent to the headmaster, right? But you didn't have to kind of choose between those things, and you tend to see a lot of that. In the States, you had the blessing of really having a Black staff, and that being very normal, to see teachers and administrators of extraordinarily high levels of excellence, and they expected that excellence from you. And their interpretation for any deviations in your work was, certainly you can do it, you just need to do more or do better or increase your effort. It was not about your ability. And then you're just immersed in an environment where there's lots of other people who are excellent as well. I wasn't unusual by any means. So, when I go places, I don't think like, I'm super smart or super capable. There's a ton of people like that, right? So, but when you're kind of immersed in that environment, and you grow to fill the expectations that are set by you, right? And during that, you develop more confidence in your skill set. You develop more confidence in yourself. You adopt very high expectations for yourself. So when you're even outside of that environment, you can maintain it. It's a terrific, foundation. The work, I figured that in the 5 years that I was there, I probably did 8.5 years worth of work. It's just a different level of rigor.
Wow. And for those patrons out there from Harrison's College and Lodge and so forth, just enjoy this conversation for what it is, and let's not, because I don't know if you had it in your year, but sports was a huge deal. And it's just so funny that there's this stigma, and I think it's a rightful stigma with Combermarians. Yes, we have our own IAN after. And hearing you speak gives me so much pride, because I think I also felt somewhat half in, half out because of that Trinidadianness that I have. But you're absolutely right in stating, and I didn't even think about it as you're saying it, the balance of excellence. I would not be where I am today without hockey, which I was introduced with from Combermere. And what you said about, Black excellence and having Black teachers, I want you to expand on that, because I think we take that for granted in the Caribbean. And I want you to share, that difference that you see and why it's important to have that compared to the New York upbringing.
Yeah. So, just from a contextual perspective, if you go back to 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, prior to that, because of segregation and separate but equal, Black students all had Black teachers, right? After that, within the 10 years after that decision was made in 1954, about almost 50% of Black teachers were eliminated in that decade that followed, and 90% of Black principals. So you have a massive purging, right, of Black teachers and administrators, and that gap being filled by white teachers and administrators who have high levels of anti-Black bias, right? And in those times, it was very explicit, right, and vitriolic, very low levels of expectations, and high levels of anti-Black bias. That is not a healthy environment in which one should be educated, particularly in your formative years. And millions of Black people had to endure that. And then even on top of that, you're not seeing yourself or your future self, right? Because teachers are extraordinarily important and inspirational. In front of you, you're always seeing, kind of someone else who's interpreting your actions and your work product differently. That can have, a significant effect, right? And there's many stories and also research that talks about the impact that those things can have. When I was in Barbados, you don't have that, right? You don't have any of that negative energy towards the student. The energy that you have is seeing your future self, who and these folks who are quite excellent in their fields, right? They're not mediocre in any way, shape, or form, setting extraordinarily high levels of expectations. And when you deviate from that, it's not because you can't do better. They don't lower the standard, right? The standard stays the same, right? And you need to rise to it. And the expectation is that you will. That's really important because it allows you to see, teachers and exceptional people as it's a normal thing, right? It's part of your expectation. It's not a very unusual thing. We did some informal surveys, and there are many Black people in the States who, all the way from, kindergarten to PhD, they may have one or two Black educators over the entirety of their educational career. That's neither normal nor healthy, right? We didn't have those things, right, at 𝐶𝐈. And you also had a very strong sense of community. There's a certain energy with 𝐶𝐈, right? Like, we think the world of everyone, but we don't put anyone above ourselves, right? And you've done the work and you've been through the rigor to feel comfortable in that. You've earned it, quite frankly. And I think that does a lot because, one of the things I talk to people about is, my view of myself and my capabilities is not dependent on somebody else's view. It doesn't rise or fall with their view of me. And that's a really important foundation to have. And we try to ensure that our kids have that. But it's really important. And it's often more difficult to do if you don't have that very supportive environment, very high expectations. When I wrote that piece about 𝐶𝐈, people were like, where does this school exist? Like, can we have it up here? Right?
Yeah, it is. I feel like a very unearthed sense of pride right now. Hey, Pauline here. This is possibly going to be the worst ad you've ever heard because I'm just doing this for my marketing expenditure. AC Marketing is the one financing this podcast, so I have to do this for the books. If you want to know what we do, head over to acmarketingcaribbean.com. If not, just keep listening to this podcast. That's pretty much it. I've done my job if my accountant is listening to this. I wanted to ask you because I started LinkedIn Local Community about a year ago, and it started in Trinidad and expanded to Barbados. And what I found was a sentiment of, I don't know if the right word is just being unsure of yourself, questioning yourself. And I personally have gone through it too as an entrepreneur, as a female entrepreneur, where my value is always in question. And we don't necessarily see our own values. So when I present, I have a presentation about personal branding, I always get a lot of questions afterwards about, what they need to do. They're afraid of putting themselves out there. And I think, I had to go through my own process through trial and error. And also, I also have this factor where if I don't produce content, I don't eat because it's my job. Right. But when it comes to your perspective and your advice, what would you tell folks listening to this who have just lost their job, and we've seen this huge acceptance to remote working? And I find it so amazing that we have such talented people that aren't equipped to share that with the rest of the world. So what would you tell them?
That's a big question, right? One of the things I think is very important is there's a tremendous amount of transformation that's happening right now. I think we're in an inflection point. And you can see that from the distance working. You can also see it from the distance learning, right? The fact that universities could pivot within a week to go to online classes. And what is the opportunity if you are in such a position, because people's positions vary widely, right? To position yourself to be doing better once this thing is open. That's kind of a very, general statement. There's the question of, are there skills that you can provide to folks on a consulting work on a part-time basis? I was very fortunate, right, as an entrepreneur, that we can adjust to these things in terms of being able to actually work from home, pivoting to doing more things virtually, right, and using the platforms such as this for increased, consulting work, and a lot of our finance work is also done, virtually. Is there the opportunity to dramatically increase your skill set in a particular area, right? A lot of people tend to, go back to school during downturns, or increase the level of, freelance type work in the interim. That's from the individual's perspective. And then it's also, what are governments and corporations doing, right, to be able to increase demand for their products and services so they can rebound from this hiring contraction, right? Which is a much broader, more programmatic kind of discussion.
So what you're saying is you start to expand your skill sets.
Yeah, one of it is, the natural thing that people do is you try to retool, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you get a certificate in data analytics. And it really, this is a very kind of broad response because I don't know the particular individual's kind of background, but people will try to upskill, right? Maybe if they're in a medical field, or if they're in, finance or information technology, the services areas, you might try to increase your skill set through certificates and things like that, of that nature. Or you may try to do, consulting, right, on a part-time basis to help, other corporations or other people. But it becomes very difficult depending on what your skill set is and what you were doing prior to COVID and this kind of massive job loss that was associated with it.
What about people in the fields that are in demand and that these individuals have the skill sets but are too afraid to even apply because it's so far-fetched to them?
Then if they have the skill set and they're in demand, that's phenomenal. Then that's just a mental block, right? That's just a matter of saying, just go for it, right? If you're blessed to be in that position, the worst somebody could do is say no, leave nothing on the table, right? What I always tell people inside or outside of recessions or depressions is, state what you are and what you want, and then go work accordingly to get it, right? And so if you're in a position where you're in that type of field, which is a wonderful blessing, don't let fear stop you. Just attack it, right? And tons of men, a lot of men do that, right? You're not totally qualified for the job, but you go after it anyway, right? And for someone who is qualified fully, I would say go after it. Leave nothing on the table.
Okay, that may have been personal. But I can't recall that response to that. That'll be later. Okay, so who is Shawn? Like, what does Shawn do outside of blacktax.com? For me, I do triathlons, which in itself is just such my form of escapism. What is yours?
That's a really good question. That's one of those. Outside of that is really just, spending time with family, right? With my wife and the kids, and making sure that they are, well positioned for this world, academically and athletics and leadership and all the other things that we, take them through. In terms of, downtime and things of that nature, I'm always trying to learn. So if it's not something associated with economic advancement, right, which is how do we grow businesses and how do we drive employment and make sure that capital is available for people, then I'm a big, I like history. So I do a lot of reading on history. I do a lot of reading on history from time immemorial, right? And as weird as that sounds, that relaxes me. It's a good distraction.
Gosh, talk about academic. Jeez. I about here with my swimming, riding, and running, and you're sitting down there reading books. All right, okay. You like my Bajan slang? I about here.
Yeah, I hear
it. So, do you get to because this is one of my things. I always say I'll do it for retirement, but I feel like that's just an excuse. I should start doing it now. Do you have any Bajan authors that you read?
Not off the top. The last book that I read was about the history of Karbamir, actually, right? And which I thought was absolutely fascinating because the school's over 300 years old, right? But other than that, not a whole lot of Bajan authors that I read. I read a lot of things about economics and history and policy and stuff like that.
What's the Karbamir book called?
Let me see if I can recall the name properly. It is Karbamir School and Barbadian Society by Sandiford and Newton.
Gosh, Sandiford is such a Bajan name. I will make note of that.
Yes, it is.
That is so amazing. I didn't even know that was a thing. So I'm gonna have to put that on my to-do list.
Yep. And it was interesting because I even learned a lot about that. They go into a lot of detail and they talk about how heavily Barbados in general invested in education. It is no accident that the literacy rate is amongst the highest in the world. I think when I was there, it was like top 3 in the world. Might be higher now, right?
Yeah.
There was an extraordinary level of GDP that was allocated to education. So what you're going to get from that? You're going to get outstanding, well-trained and developed individuals. It's not random. It's not an accident.
I actually I know quite a number of individuals who went to Hofstra, which I saw you talking Hofstra, on hockey scholarships from Barbados. There was a coach during a period of time. She brought a lot of Caribbean athletes across, and I think that opened the gates to exposure, not just academically, but obviously through cultural understanding, which I would like to actually ask with your family does that Bajan upbringing, is it strong? Is it there? What is, how many kids do you have first and foremost?
We have 2, boy and a girl.
Okay. What's the Bajan influence like there?
I mean, it's present. They're always trying to get me to talk in a Bajan accent.
I did hear a bit of it in your talk. I was like, I could hear a little bit.
Yeah, any little intonation, right? Or when we take vacation, if we go back home, and the more when you're around people, the more it starts to come out. They get thrilled by that. But they're aware of the upbringing, right? They're aware of the foods, right? They're aware of the customs. One of the things that we tell the kids is, you should know your culture. Like anyone and everyone should know the culture, and someone outside of your culture shouldn't be introducing you to it, right? And they certainly shouldn't be giving you permission to be a part of it. So make sure you know it before somebody tells you about your own stuff, right? So we try to expose them to that, and they're very much aware So, and they're also very aware of the work that I do in finance and all this stuff, when it comes to the financial cost of discrimination. Like they're very aware, they get it.
So let's go to where this desire to get this data and research, where did this start? Where did the concept for blacktax.com come from?
Yeah, I think it's the kernel for it started with just me over time seeing, every once in a while, every 6 months or so, you'll see an article that's written about some research that was done about discrimination in a particular marketplace against Black people, right? So I would see those things, whether it was housing or the automotive space or finance space. And as I read them, it always seemed to me like it was a tax, right? A particularly nefarious tax because you don't actually benefit from it, right? And I was like, at one point I'll kind of come back and catalog these things and take a look at it. So it kind of started from that. And then it transitioned to, I was, running, mergers and acquisitions for the subsidiary of a global business. It's probably about $1 billion. So I was, traveling a lot and doing acquisitions all over the place. And that wasn't sustainable. When I say traveling a lot, it's probably like 80% of the time, right? And it was thinking about, what am I going to do differently? And what am I going to do to have impact? And to have impact in terms of, the wealth gap, being able to deal with some of these issues, I started thinking about, okay, how do we help people to manage their resources better? Because we're all figuring this stuff out as we go, right? Because of the history, you haven't had the legacy of intergenerational wealth transfer and the knowledge flowing from generation to generation. And then I thought about, some of the issues that our communities are dealing with, and are all tied to, jobs, business, and capital. So I was just like, after you help people transform their financial situations, we should encourage them to do business with themselves, with us, and others as well, right? But you can't start with like, hey, you should do business with Black business, because there are negative biases that we have about our own businesses, right? And people, you'll hear lots of concerns or complaints about quality and service and a whole host of things. So what I wanted to do was, if people think those things are a cost, which they seem to speak in those ways, or if they seem like they think about commercializing Black enterprise like it's a charity, I'll help you out kind of thing, I said, well, let's see what the real costs are. So then I went down that path of looking at what the financial cost of discrimination is. Because if you can see that and understand what it is presently, and if you can understand what the historical context was, you see the enormity of the problem, and then you tend to want to be a vested part of the solution, which is, what can I do to change this? And what you can do is this PhD framework, which is about how you deploy your resources in ways that create jobs and business and provide capital, and encouraging others to do the same thing, whether it's your corporation, the university you went to, the church that you're part of, the federal, local, state government, whatever it is, they should be operating in that way so we can kind of move out of this situation.
How do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is going to, in your opinion, what's the biggest perception that's going to be shifted based on the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a big question. I would kind of approach it like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And the focus on, police brutality, right? With these really naked and grotesque executions that were recorded, right, on video and shown around the world, is opening a lot of people's eyes to the level of discrimination and injustice that Black people face, right? And so that's calling a lot of things into question that weren't there. So the question is, how are you demonstrating, right, that Black Lives Matter? And if you're an institution or a company, how do you do that when you have, some statue of some white supremacist, right, that was committed to Black subordination in the most ruthless, violent way, honored in your building? You know what I mean? So people are starting to look at things like that. So I think that's really powerful that people are looking at things that they didn't look at before. I think we're at an inflection point, and what's really critical here is that the focus has got to be economic, right? So you have to look at the economic aspect of things, not just the social and civil aspect of things. And we have to be very careful about things that I call that are non-economic symbolism, right? So you take down a statue. What does that mean, right? You change the flag that you're flying in your state capital, whatever. What does that mean? Did that create a job? Did it create or expand a business? Did it provide capital, right? In our communities, and there are massive deficits across those things. So the movement is powerful because it's global. It has a lot of people taking intense looks at organizations, at companies, at individuals looking at themselves, knowing very little about the history and the experience of Black people in America, which you could, on one hand, seems kind of crazy. On the other hand, it's stripped out of the curriculum and largely ignored when it comes to media sources. So that's terrific. More people seeing things that they didn't see before and wanting to have a positive outcome. It just needs to pivot into things that are economic, that are specific, and that are scalable, right? And that's the message, right, that I'm trying to help people, see and understand and implement.
Are you a small business owner? Are you looking for maybe a place that will give you an address, but you don't necessarily want to pay that astronomical amount of rent? Or maybe you need a space outside of your home? Go check out Regis. They have locations in Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, and Guyana. Google Regis Caribbean and tell them Pauline sent you.
So I had to put my mic on mute because I'm like, I'm just like, yes. I like that conversation because it comes from a point of what is the action being taken that will eventually see generational wealth be easily transferred to the Black community. And I want, because I don't know if you sense in this theme of difficult questions, I would like you to share insight, because we have these issues in the Caribbean, but it's more, it's quieter. We won't necessarily have the knee on the neck situation, which unfortunately Trinidad had something similar recently. But I feel as though, and I'm not disputing the importance of that conversation, and violence is something that is very prevalent in the police force in the United States. I just want to talk about it from a local context in the Caribbean, because we have a tendency to see outside and say that don't affect us. When I talk about feminism and what women have to go through, they're like, that's American conversation. And it deflects our issues, because I remember seeing a meme that said, in Trinidad, there's no room for racism in Trinidad. And there's these emojis that are all, because we are very multicultural. And for me, that says to me, leaves no room to have a conversation about our issues. So bringing it back to your space and the information that you've presented with blacktext.com, what can we learn in the Caribbean from the information that you've pulled?
Yeah, so I get, people reach out to me from all over the world, right? Because, they've seen the talks, or, they've gotten the book and stuff like that. And basically what they say is the same thing's happening here, right? So what we all have to understand is high levels of anti-Black bias, which manifests itself in a form of discrimination from individuals and institutions and governments, is part of the legacy of slavery and colonialism. And almost all Black people on planet Earth, maybe you can, go back and forth about the Ethiopians, are descendants, right, of slavery and colonialism, right? So, and anti-Blackness is perhaps the strongest anti-group bias there is. It manifests itself everywhere. And again, I focus on the economics of the situation. right? Your ability to accumulate wealth is directly proportional to the level of anti-group, or in this specific context, anti-Black bias that you face. You can go across all these countries and look at who has the wealth and who doesn't. I mean, my focus is always economics, right? It's not personal, it's not emotional, it's not any of that stuff. At the end of the day, bias leads to discrimination, and discrimination reduces trade. It has an economic impact, and you can see it. So if the world is egalitarian in whatever country that they say race doesn't matter, then that should show up in the distribution of assets and resources, and it's not the case.
So it's, you can look at the numbers basically, because it's look at the wealth, because I look at Barbados and it's made up of mostly, you know, people of African descendants.
Yeah.
Yet the wealth is
Hyper concentrated.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
insane. It's so, to me, it's so obvious in Barbados. It's like, you know, I don't want to drop names at being controversial, but you know, we get hired in like the most popular fast food companies in Barbados. Just recently launched this huge delivery service, right? So they just painted a lot of cars. To me, it's just screaming climate change issues. But this is being praised, and they're like, you know, at least they're employing people. People have to be employed. And I'm just like, why aren't we asking the difficult questions? Because being employed doesn't mean that the person is living a life that they want to live. They're just living below the means. And I see these similarities in Trinidad. In Trinidad, there's a specific company that owns the biggest, like to the point where this company is seen as the healing of the nation, because you pay $20, which is the equivalent of, let's say, $3 for a snack box, right? And we complain about the service we get when we go and we pay that $20. But then the woman that's behind the counter is being underpaid, you know? So if you don't support that business, then that person doesn't get paid. Like, how do I even approach this conversation? Because I even myself feel conflicted and confused.
So you have to look at it in different components, right? None of this stuff is kind of binary. So the first thing is are people employed or not, right? So you have a job or you don't. Then the second issue is, are you underemployed, which is, are you employed in areas that are below what your skill set, right, requires? And because, you know, the person who's, you know, behind that register, that might be a person who's capable of doing far more than that, right? But that's what's available to them. And that's problematic. The other issue is, you know, it's not necessarily that role behind the register is a bad role, right? It's not. You want it to be a transitional role, right? Which is what a person does for a time, and then they're able to continue to progress, right? If they desire to do so, as opposed to that's kind of what they're locked into. So, you know, when I look at this PhD framework, the first question is, okay, well, are we properly represented on your payroll and in your supply chain, right? So what's, and that's like of your total payroll, how much of that is going to Black people, right? And then you can look at the distribution from, you know, the white collar workers to the non-white collar workers. We tend to be hyper concentrated in the lowest kind of wage skill set type of areas. So it's really looking at that broad swath. Some of this stuff is intentional and some of it is subconscious. I don't know, because I'm not a mind reader, what's driving people's minds, but I'm just interested in the impact and the outcome. So it's how are we properly represented there. The second piece of it is these companies have robust supply chains, right? They purchase products and services from a bunch of other companies to be able to create, deliver, administer, and sell their own products. So do you have Black companies within that supply chain? Because that's a really, really, you know, powerful thing. And if you go into like the US, or if you went to like New York City, for example, they spend billions of dollars on an annual basis. About 1% of that goes to Black enterprise, right? There's a tremendous opportunity there. And that's an extraordinarily diverse city, right? But there's a tremendous opportunity there to create tens of thousands of jobs by actually having more Black enterprise in the supply chain, it's a similar thing, when it comes to, these larger, entities, right, in the Caribbean. So that the first part is, what do those numbers look like? Because a big portion of a company's spend is on what they procure, and then how they transform it to make a product, and then how they administrate it. It's people costs, people in inputs, and are we well represented there? That's a huge area. And a lot of companies don't look at things that way. A lot of folks don't really ask questions, when it comes to that. So we wind up with a lot of symbolism. The Caribbean is dealing with the legacy of colonialism, right? And you can have, Black people and other peoples, right, as part of the government. But when you get into the economy, right, like people who own businesses, the capital's still hyper concentrated among certain groups, right? And the least amount of representation tends to be with Black people.
Pauline here to let you know about Microsoft 365. As a small business owner, it's been very challenging to, look for sales, increase your clientele. But one thing I am sure of is my business has to be housed in a cloud solution. Not only does it assist with my bottom line and rent expense, but it allows me to track the productivity of my team members. You need to go check it out. Microsoft 365.
I think the biggest takeaway that I get from what you're saying is we need to ask questions, because it's not a black and white situation. It's so complex. We just need to start somewhere, and it starts with asking questions.
Yeah, that have a focus on like jobs, business, and capital, right? Because if you're not specific, if the assumption is you'll get to the economics, that's not how it works. Right? People, in the US, there are massive issues with, civil rights and social aspects, right? And the thought process seems to have been like, once we sort those things out, the economics will naturally flow. And that's not the case. Neither historical evidence, and that's just not how the economy works. You can have massive change without any economic change. So the questions that you're asking have to be with a focus on, is it being stimulative for job creation, business development, and providing capital? If you could get your dream contract, and that dream contract can bankrupt you because you've got to deploy a lot of working capital to deliver that product and service long before you get paid for it, right? So we not only have to make sure that we're stimulating demand for your products and services, but we got to make sure that we're providing capital so that you can meet it. And then if you're oversubscribed, part of the capital you need is going to be to hire and to add infrastructure. So they both have to go hand in hand, right? And it's a framework that really applies to everything, and quite frankly, applies everywhere. Government says, hey, I got this great policy, that's wonderful. How's it creating jobs, business, and providing capital in our community specifically, right? Which is not to take away from anybody else. You want everybody to be happy and successful. But the issue is, what is it doing specifically for the Black community? Because we tend to be least, last, and left out in almost all circumstances. And if you look at the share of wealth that we own in various countries, it's always at the bottom.
Wow. And this is such a timely discussion for my professional journey, because, I've always been, I guess it's somewhat on an unconscious level, or maybe now it's coming to the forefront, thinking that this Black conversation is so outside of my realm and outside of my being. But it just basically, when people tell me, especially within triathlon community recently, it's like, I don't see color. But when you say that, it's like, okay, well, you're basically saying you're not seeing the oppression that has been, millions of people died and hundreds of years of slavery. And I think this Black Lives Matter movement, for me, my personal journey is understanding what that means for me and putting weight to what that is, and like hearing your perspective on it from an analytical perspective has just been like mind blown. um, and okay, so I'm going to shift a bit and I'm going to ask a question about CARICOM, right? So
Okay.
what I mentioned earlier.
Yep, I will try to answer it if I can.
Okay, so I have assigned you, it's official, you are the head of CARICOM, right? And you've been placed in charge of the CARICOM, the Caribbean islands and economy. What would be the first thing you would do as the head of CARICOM?
I don't think I am well equipped to answer that question.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to do it enough justice, right? I would approach it in a kind of different way, because like I think, outside of CARICOM and outside of the region, I think like trade policy is really critical, right? I don't think that the U.S. does enough commerce with the Caribbean. I don't think it does enough commerce with countries on the continent of Africa, right? And I think that trade policy there needs to be augmented for more business to be done and for capital to be provided to assist in that, because that leads to greater job creation across the region, right? And it needs to be more of an intentional and policy effort associated with that. From the CARICOM perspective, I would have to leave that up to experts that could speak more cogently about what would need to be done to maximize that opportunity.
Spoken like the true analytical mind that you have. That is a great answer. And I agree completely, because I see that policy also need to exist within the CARICOM sphere. Like, we don't import from each other. And we also have a tendency to think that because something is foreign, it's better.
Right.
So I can see, I mean, even with, you say, limited knowledge, I think that is still applicable to us, and it can be something that we can look at from a, especially now with COVID-19 and how the Caribbean has dealt with this way better than some quote unquote first world countries.
Yep. Yep.
I think now is the time to band together and really see ourselves who we are. And I mean, we're amazing people, right?
Yep.
Okay. So with that said, I want you to share with our listeners where to find you if they want to read your book, see your thoughts, just find you.
Yeah. So if you to get our books or the ebooks, you can go to www.blacktaxed, and that's with an ed, like past tense, .com. That's www.blacktaxed.com. I'm on LinkedIn as Shawn Rochester, and Facebook as the same, and Instagram and Twitter as Black Taxed. On both of those, and then you can always Google, Shawn Rochester Black Tax, and you can see some of my talks that I did at Google corporate headquarters, and that I did at Hofstra University as well, which are generally viewed as master classes on the subject.
Great. Thank you so much, Shawn, for sharing your time. I know this podcast is from the audience, but I learned so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for reaching out and taking the initiative, and giving me the opportunity to chat with you on this platform and to reach more people.
Amazing. All right.
Thanks for joining us this week. Make sure to subscribe in iTunes, Google Podcast, or wherever you listen for your podcasts. Don't forget to join the community at our website, LinkedInLocalCaribbean.com. If you liked this show, you might want to check out our next LinkedIn Local event by following the hashtags on LinkedIn. Search for hashtag LinkedIn Local Caribbean.